Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the RIEL Seminar Series. Welcome everybody in the room. It's great to see so many faces in the room, and also welcome to our online attendees, which there's also quite a few of you, so it's great to have such a great attendance. Just some quick housekeeping. In the case of an emergency, we will evacuate out onto the breezeway, the grass lawns in between the buildings, and the toilets are just out to the right here, so in that central column. Today's seminar will be recorded, and we will also be using the in-room microphones. So they will be picking up noise, so please keep the chatter up the back, all the naughty kids up the back, to a minimum, please. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Today we have Nick and Lou, who are botanists from the Herbarium, and they're going to tell us all about the fantastic work that they do with plants. Make sure this is working for you. So I'll hand over.
Oh, thank you. Lou, thank you everybody for coming out this morning and the opportunity to be here today to talk about some of the work that we do at the Northern Territory Herbarium. I guess we're really here today to provide an overview of the herbarium and the many varied things that we're involved in across plant sciences in the NT. But we particularly wanted to explore the wide range of opportunities that exist, I think, to support research, interaction, collaboration between CTU and the herbarium. Before we start, I'd firstly like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. In the case of us here in the top end, the Larrakia people, and pay my respects to the elders and extend that respect to their descendants past, present and emerging. So, as I mentioned, we wanted to provide an overview of our work and sorry, I just got to rearrange the notes here a little bit, and provide an overview of our current work. And we'll start by giving a bit of an introduction to the NT Herbarium and its history, talk a bit about what our role is and where that fits in from both a research and management perspective, before touching on some of the challenges and opportunity that face the plant sciences in the Northern Territory and biological collections more generally in a current and future sense. And really how this might provide a range of research and teaching opportunities for the university and us. So the Northern Territory Herbarium. Who, where and why. So I don't know, I'm hoping that most people here know what a herbarium is, but for those who don't, a herbarium is really a reference collection or library of plant specimens akin to other natural sciences collections, and it provides a record of occurrence in two dimensions, both time and space. But, you know, those physical specimens can support a lot more than just that. A herbarium is really underpinned by those physical specimens that we hold, and they're really an essential asset and infrastructure for a range of purposes, not the least of which is taxonomic research. And I guess that's how typically and historically these types of collections have been framed. But it's much more than that. The specimens and the data that they hold provide knowledge and across a range of fields outside of taxonomy, from ecology through to heritage, history, and many other things. Those objects that we hold, there's a very dry piece of federal legislation called the Cultural Heritage Act, I think it's called, I've probably forgotten, but those specimens actually are recognised, and we have a legal responsibility under that piece of legislation. Those specimens are recognised as what they call objects of movable cultural heritage. So we've got, I guess, a responsibility for the custodianship of those in a sense. So it's important to note that, you know, we don't do this in isolation. Herbaria function as part of a nationally and globally linked network, and we share information and specimens through that network, which is really, I guess, primarily framed around advancing an understanding of diversity. but it also aids in many other things. And this is one of Lou's kind of pet interests, is the systematising of the application of names in a global sense, particularly when we're thinking about the introduced flora of Australia. So, from a biological sciences perspective, those collections inform our understanding of diversity and change, and the physical specimens support taxonomy directly, so species description and delimitation. But the physical specimens, and this touches on that previous point, they also provide a nomenclatural reference point, which is, they're referable specimens to a name and a concept of a species or a taxon. They're verifiable specimens against which we can actually then test and scrutinise those concepts and names for their applicability and validity. So there's most collections that we hold have a range of other data associated with them, and as metadata, they, starting with a collecting location. So that geographic context provides us with distribution and a perspective on change over time, because we do have that historical aspect to the collection. We've got collections dating back a couple of 100 years, and so you can actually track collections of a species over time, and there's some interesting things that are starting to be done now, particularly in the invasive species space, around looking at genetic drift and things with reference to, well, that's a buffelgrass example I'm giving there, but some work we're doing with Cyro to look at how the genetic profile of some species has changed over time. I guess in one sense, the collections that we hold provide an important provide one narrow type of long-term monitoring data that we can draw upon.
Yeah, could just go back to that slide. So I think there's an example on this slide here, which is probably gives a good example of the importance of the physical collection, in that this is was previously Eucalyptus papuana on the top right-hand side, and you can see all those dots. We had the species concept of Eucalyptus papuana right across the NT, and there were records in southern Papua New Guinea. And then at some point, people did some more work on that species group and decided that it wasn't actually all the same thing, and it got divided into several species, which two are in the NT. And so now we have Blacella bella and Blacella aborigina. And you can see they're divided kind of with a latitudinal gradient there, but it's not always the case. So if we didn't have those specimens, we wouldn't be able to untangle what the new species concepts were. So people sometimes come into the herbarium and say, oh, well, we've got all these specimens, can we just image them? Because we do have imaging in the herbarium. And the imaging is helpful, but really the value of the specimens cannot be understated. There's all kinds of things you can do with the specimens that
don't look very closely at the outlying red dot. I spent an hour looking for that yesterday afternoon in the collection, and I had to only work out that it's actually a data error. The specimen's fine. So I mean, it's that geographic context is really important, and that's a good illustration of the importance of having that geographic context and evaluating your data. Like we do the best we possibly can and I'll talk about that coming up in curating our data, but it's not perfect.
Curation is ongoing, and the other thing is the spread in time as well as space. So whether it's looking at threatened species or invasive plants or widespread species, we can get a lot of information about from the both in space in terms of their distribution, how they look in different places, but also might be changes in time. So species change their distribution over time.
With this bit, and you can get on the camera.
Okay, species change their distribution over time, and obviously, particularly with invasives, we can get a kind of a history or a time series analysis of where things are going, how they move around in the landscape. And we need lots of different points on the map for that, and that's why we have so many different records.
And that verifiable data, it really underpins a lot of many different things, you know, and I've listed some there from the dry legislation and things like that, but through to actual species and land management applications, you know, species distribution models. There's a species distribution model down here that was underpinned by sorry, it's an old version, Caroline, underpinned by records at that point in time. But then, as Lou's mentioned, weed risk technical assessments, biosecurity pipelines, diagnostics, things like that. So
it's increasingly important now with the application of iNaturalist and other sources of information that distributions of species get underpinned by actual physical collections. So we might sometimes have a distribution map where we might present, certainly on our Flora NT, we'll provide specimen and observation data on there, but you can actually see the difference between them. And if there's a species where you have a whole lot of observation records but no specimens, it's not to say that it's an incorrect distribution, but it certainly should provoke a question: are they real, or are they potentially a misidentification with something else?
Yeah. So in terms of who we actually are, we're a herbarium collection, a biological collection. We hold approximately 290,000 specimens. That's primarily focused on the vascular flora. Almost said fauna then. We are very much Northern Australian focused. But that is not just restricted to the Territory, it's North Australia more generally. And we do have a focus on our nearby neighbouring regions. And that is really also as an information source for the biosecurity surveillance and diagnostics functions that we are involved in. We do hold specimens of non-vascular and fungi, non-vascular plants, so mosses, liverworts, hornworts, and marine and freshwater algae, but that is a much smaller component of our collection.
I might just mention briefly, in terms of collections from outside of the Northern Territory, the Northern Territory Herbarium holds a really significant collection of plants from Timor-Leste, which is partly from a biosecurity functionality. Northern Australian Quarantine have collected lots of specimens from Timor-Leste in the past, but also former Chief Botanist Ian Cowie has done a lot of work in Timor-Leste, and we hold a really substantial collection of plants there.
Yep. Yeah. So, and we're kind of, you know, one of the opportunities we're looking at, which we'll get to at the end, is, you know, actually enabling. Timor do not have a herbarium, but they obviously have plants and they've got interest in a wide range of things. So we're looking at trying to basically mobilise that collection somehow. Like, we've got imaging facilities now. So, you know, one thing that we're exploring is the idea of creating a virtual herbarium that we can send to Timor. So, you know, eventually we want to repatriate those specimens to Timor if we, you know, at the right time. But you know, in the interim, can we do something else to actually give them an uplift? So in Australian context, we're a medium-sized herbarium at 290,000 specimens. But there's a couple of unique characteristics about our institution which are worth highlighting. We actually have two physical facilities. So we've got a herbarium in the top end out here at Palmerston, which is our main collection nowadays, and we've got a smaller herbarium at the Desert Park in Alice Springs. So, you know, that's kind of unique in that no other jurisdictional herbarium in Australia kind of operates with two campuses, and uniquely we're the only jurisdictional herbaria placed in the tropics, and Alice Springs are the only jurisdictional herbaria placed in the arid zone. So that really frames a lot of what we do and what we hold, and that decentralised model really gives us the opportunity to engage a bit more locally, we think, with what's going on in those areas. So that's kind of unique for us. There's 4 staff. We're only small, 4 of us here in Alice Springs. Darwin, and 2 in Alice Springs. But yeah, and you know, that is a little bit of a function of history. The main herbarium in the Northern Territory was actually initially established in Alice Springs as part of the animal industry branch of the Commonwealth. in the 50s. There was a smaller herbaria established in Darwin in the 60s, and then that kind of stayed the same with the main collection in Alice till 1988, when a decision was made to move the main collection to Darwin and have a smaller facility in Alice Springs. Having said that, we're just about out of space, and we're located in a shopping mall, so it's not really a purpose-built facility. So we're going to, at some stage in the very near future, run out of space and need to come up with another solution. So, oh, hang on. I'm looking at the wrong thing. What do we actually do, though? So you can really break down what we do into 4 or 5 main different functions. There's obviously the collection management, which goes directly to maintaining the definitive list or checklist of the NT's flora. We provide information and diagnostic services, as we've kind of touched on, and we'll talk about that a bit more. But then all of that really goes towards providing a platform for delivering information and advice on the flora of the NT in a number of different ways. In our spare time, given that most of us are kind of at least aspiring botanists, in my case, we do like to do some taxonomy and systematics, but it's hard to fit it in sometimes around all the other things that we get involved in.
I mean, I think because we're such a small institution, compared to other herbaria in other parts of the country, we really can't afford to specialise too much. People have to be able to do a lot of different things, and it makes us necessarily very applied as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. So maintenance of the collection is kind of our bread and butter, I suppose, and that's really to try and maintain it as a contemporary asset to support research and management. So having up-to-date names and up-to-date data really goes towards, cementing our place in a bunch of different functions for a range of stakeholders. You can break down that curation into a couple of different, or 3 different parts. There's the physical curation of the specimens, so the arrangement, labelling, quarantine, preservation, which in itself is a challenge in the top end particularly. We're dealing with a hot, humid, tropical environment, so trying to keep dead plants away from insects so they don't get munched is a challenge. Leads to big power bills trying to keep the place cool and dry, but that's what we do. So there's the scientific curation, which is actually, I guess, the taxonomy on the ground, the application of names and concepts, and that's an ongoing process. And then all of that really goes towards curating our data and turning that kind of effort into information that can be used for a range of purposes. That curation is fundamental to what we call the checklist, which is really the definitive list of the currently used scientific names for the Northern Territory for native and naturalised plants. It's contemporary in both its scope and taxonomy, so we try to keep it as up to date as we possibly can.
And on that point, congratulations for incorporating the Corymbia and Black Keller.
You're one of the few people that says congratulations on that. Mostly we get do that. Thank you. So in a narrow sense, it is, you could view this as a list of plants for the NT, but in an extended sense, it actually embeds a significant amount of species assessment effort on a variety of fronts. So there's a whole field of endeavour that Lou spends a lot of time thinking about to do with native and introduced status of plants. There's conservation status is embedded within that checklist, which is another part of our division's core function. And then there's a whole lot of stuff in that list that's unsaid but is actually maintained in the digital checklist, and that's to do with, for example, plant utilisation and their cultivated status, or whether they're in cultivation or not. It's actually the more you look at it, the more information is contained in that beyond just the names.
Yeah, so that we hold plants which are also not in the flora. We hold plants that are cultivated only, as well as plants from other jurisdictions. So we have a whole lot of a whole lot of species in our collection that aren't out in the wild.
And we spend a lot of time thinking about that grey area between when something is, it might occur in the NT, but is it actually naturalised? And, can it do its thing out in the wild in a self-sustaining way? That's what we refer to as pre-naturalisation states, and we're investing a lot of time in trying to account for those things better. I guess they're what some people might refer to, Lou, as like the sleeper weeds and things like that. So that's something that we're particularly interested in kind of doing better.
And, there's a distinction between something which is casual or inventive compared to being fully naturalised. And then, of course, there's the things that might occur, the border between Northern Territory and Western Australia. That
is it here yet? Or
we think it might be here. It's useful for us. We like to hold specimens of those taxa as well, so that when someone like Kim Brennan or someone else goes and has a look around the border, that finds something it's actually here. And sometimes we have quite substantial range extensions into the territory.
So, in terms of the scope of that checklist, it's really focused on that native and naturalised flora. We're kind of sitting at about 5,000 species, plus or minus another, say, 500 infra-specific taxa on top of that. But so subspecies and varieties, things like that. With about 800 of those being endemic and about 10% of the flora being naturalised, which is, it's not insignificant, but in terms of a national context, it's a lot less than many other places, and that's a function of degree of, a whole lot of things, modification, intensification, all of those kind of things.
In comparison, other states that have had a longer history of settlement and more intensive modification of the landscape would be usually between 20 and 30% in Australia, something around that.
So Lou, I'll let you talk about this one, but this is kind of about the rate of naturalisation.
So this is a graph that I presented at Australian Weeds Conference a few years ago, which is just an indication of some of the kinds of information that we can derive from the data that the NT holds. So this data is actually from the checklists rather than the actual collections themselves, and it gives you a measure of the rate of new naturalizations as recorded in the checklists. And we can see with this that here we go. There's some more points that are meant to come out. The actual annual rate of new naturalizations over the last 40 years hasn't changed much. You can see that line's fairly straight. It's at around 4. And you can see that there was a big jump in new naturalizations that happened in the 1990s. And you could probably explain some of that with the change in our conceptions of the environment and so on, in that people are probably looking for a lot more species during that period of time. If you go before 1990, really there wasn't much in the way of invasive biology as a science. People didn't conceive of weeds perhaps in the same way. But that steady rate of about 4 per year is ongoing. And as I was saying, some of those species that we get in the Northern Territory are actually new to Australia. So we're right on the front line here in terms of the north and western part of Australia, and we get a surprising number of new taxa that turn up here that have not found anywhere else in Australia in the wild. And it is about 9% of the flora, which is...
I missed that one. So the checklist, like we talk about the checklist, but the checklist is really what we would refer to as a consensus census. So it really, it represents a significant combined effort by not only us in isolation, but the broader herbarium or herbaria community under the auspices of the Council of the Heads of Australasian Herbaria. So all of those herbaria that we've got there. And that's really about trying to update and maintain the nomenclature and concepts as practically as possible with that broader community. So, the herbaria work together to try and use the same names for the same taxonomic identities. However, they're not always in sync, and many people probably are aware of that. We're lucky in Australia in that we're kind of at this optimal size of resourcing to make this work, and most of the time we we do agree, and it's a fairly robust system that arrives at what we call the national species list through the Australian Plant Census. But, you know, everybody sometimes agrees to disagree about the way we apply names and concepts. And a good one that is probably an illustration of that for the people here in the top end is sorghum. So speargrass, we maintain that sorghum is a complex entity at the generic level. Others in Northern Australia do not, and they've lumped them all into one thing. So it's something to be aware of, but it is something that there are tools available. And I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but there's a R package called APC Align, which basically is a really neat tool for taking a set of names and pumping it through the APC and the Australian Plant Name Index, and trying to use fuzzy matching to tell you what the current name for particularly old data sets. That's really handy. So, for example, that Papuana, Eucalyptus papuana example you used before, we've got a whole lot of vegetation survey data within our department. It's not ours. We don't curate it, so, you know, it's not our fault. That it still uses that name. You know, you could take that name and that data and push it through that R package, and basically it should resolve based on geography of where it came from to either Blakella aporingia or Blakella bella. So it's a pretty neat tool.
I'll say it's one of the things that I learned when I came to the herbarium and learned more about the way the systems work, is really that the model of consensus here is really it's a bottom up kind of model. It's not the case that, you know,
we get a decree from Q that tells us
this is not how it works. Is people actually have to agree. Each herbarium actually maintains its own set of names, and we're fortunate, as Nick said before, that in Australia we've got the capacity to have some kind of system to get some consensus about that.
And it's important to remember that, you know, these tools and this APC view is the Australian view. So it's kind of like, you know, Australia doesn't always necessarily agree with the rest of the world, and sometimes for good reason, sometimes for not good reason. So So
it's and if you compare with, say, the US, you know, they don't have anything
like
equivalent to what we have. They're in a much greater sense of disarray in terms of their nomenclature than what we are, because we've got, you know, fewer states. We can kind of get in a room and talk about it. I think Europe is probably closer to having some kind of concordance system. But, you know, most places don't. Most parts of the world don't have anything equivalent.
No. So really, all of that scientific, physical curation, that feeds directly into the management and curation of our flora data, which, you know, in turn flows to the checklist and then is transformed into information. The NT Flora website, which is down here, that's really the key piece in that transformation in a public sense. The occurrence and species data that we hold flows to the public, and you can see there's a distribution map down here that of the kind Lou was talking about, with the green dots representing collections and the blue dots representing observations. Those fact sheets compile a whole lot of descriptive information that can assist with identification. And then all of that data eventually pushes to aggregators like the Australasian Virtual Herbarium, the ALA, and GBIF. So, you know, and that kind of feeds, well, I think it's once a week our data feeds via an API through to those things. So, you know, again, it's just a kind of a, you know, it's important for us to do good curation because our data will be scrutinised by more than just us in near real-time sense. These things become a really so the information that we have on those fact sheets comes off a lot of it comes off these labels which you see here. The label data is a really powerful evaluation and analytical data set or tool. It's high quality verifiable records and they're data rich. It's a bit hard to read there, but that label incorporates information on plant traits, ecosystem descriptions, population information in instance. So it becomes quite a deep set of data that can be drawn on. And, we're not really at this stage yet, but I know, for example, in South Australia, they work very closely with the University of Adelaide, and there's a whole bunch of undergraduate projects which are looking at extracting trait data from labels, and they're converting that into some really interesting visualizations on their Flora SA website about, plant traits, and particularly plant traits over time, because obviously there's a date associated with these things, so they can, so that's kind of a somewhat unexplored but exciting kind of future thing that's going on. Plant identification, that's something, we provide an in-person identification service that can be utilised by the public and industry. We've got an identification reference room that is available for use by appointment to public, land managers, researchers. There's quarantine protocols to get specimens in there, but once they're in there, it's a fantastic resource with microscopes, specimens for comparison, all the identification resources, etc., that can be used. And then finally, that Flora NT website, there are a whole range of identification tools available through that, from the checklist through to flora treatments, regional floras, etc. In recent times, we've been trying to kind of do a bit more extension work, and we've been involved in the provision of training, both of our own accord. Lou recently delivered a 2-day course on identifying grasses in the top end, which was a big, well, we think it was a big success.
I think it was a big success.
That's been good.
It was a lot of work.
Yeah. And last year we did we delivered a course in conjunction with the Australian Tropical Herbarium, which was basically about identifying rainforest plants. So, we're kind of biting off bits of the flora to deliver training on rather than a holistic thing. It's a bit too much to probably do in one hit. But yeah, there's particular groups that people are interested in. We're really keen to explore continuing these and developing that further. So, flora advice. Really, all of these activities support advice and information that we can give on the NT flora to a range of stakeholders. There's government, land managers, research, the public. A logical extension of those ID services is plant diagnostics. We play a pretty significant role, both our expertise and the collection, in supporting biosecurity in the Northern Territory from both a weeds and plant pathogen perspective. NT, as Lou mentioned, is a natural contact point between us and our nearest neighbours, and there's a long history exchange across that interface, which is, in a modern sense, been accelerated by human agency. So the provision of authoritative identifications from us is really embedded as part of the standard workflow for both the Commonwealth and NT biosecurity in terms of how they deal with incursions and responses. There's been a range of other examples, apart from those 4 that are listed there, which were new arrivals to Australia within the last 18 months to 2 years.
Yeah. That Mississippianthus was only a few weeks ago, a few months.
But there's a whole range of other things that we get involved in that respect, in relation to regulatory responses after that initial confirmation of plant identification from an NT weeds perspective. As I mentioned, Lou's done a lot of thinking about that grey area between naturalisation and only occurring in cultivation, and it's something that we're still working out, but we recognise it's something that we need to invest a little bit more time in thinking about to make the usefulness of our collection and our data to uplift it even more.
So we're working towards using Darwin core terminology or modifications thereof to provide a little bit more granularity.
Yeah. So I mentioned before, we've talked about introducing native status. This is a quick example of some work we've recently completed in collaboration with interstate colleagues and also ASRAC, the Arafura Swamp Rangers Aboriginal Corporation. And that's looking at the introduced or native status of water lettuce in Australia more broadly, but particularly the Northern Territory. Water lettuce is recognised as one of the kind of the worst water weeds in the world, but evaluation of it in a local context in the 1980s kind of indicated that, it did indicate that there was many reasons to think that it hadn't been introduced to the Northern Territory. It's been here for a very long time. There's cultural knowledge of it. And there are, I'm going to get the wrong word.
There was descriptions of it in Arnhem Land in the
1860s.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get the wrong word here, but there's like there's a moth that is the host plant. That's what I'm thinking. It's a host plant for a particular moth as well. That's considered native. So that led
also occurs in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, so that led to the reevaluation of it in an NT context as being native, which causes a bit of consternation nationally. Like people don't like a weed. They think is a weed being considered native.
And so this work really got triggered by colleagues in New South Wales and Queensland who wanted to nominate Pistia as a target for biological control nationally and potentially as a weed of national significance. And neither of those things could occur for a species which was considered native to Australia. And because we consider it native to the Northern Territory, it opened the question, well, do we have the same thing?
Yeah.
So we went and did a whole lot of sampling.
Yeah, and we worked with Queensland who did the genetics on it, kindly funded by New South Wales, who are the people who had the question. We don't have a definitive answer yet on the taxonomic identity, but what the work we've done clearly has shown is that the NT populations represent a clearly different lineage and behave differently ecologically to those weedy East Coast populations. We probably can't solve this problem on our own. There's a very long and complex history of the taxonomy of this species. It's only considered one thing at the moment, but there's probably at least 7 things in it from early indications. But it kind of it gave us another line of evidence to maintain our belligerent position that we think it's native. And I have said this to Lou before, but to me, this is an illustration of where we're trying to make process fit the biology rather than make the process responsive to the biology. There's no reason why we couldn't conceptualise that things that are outside of their, native range and are behaving weedy couldn't be managed as such. But the NT stuff is not like that. So so it shouldn't be considered the same way. Another major part of the advice we give is around conservation and conservation assessment. We're routinely involved in a lot of the stages of conservation assessment, although it is the responsibility, it is the remit of a different part of our division. We do hold a lot of information that contributes to that, and we're involved really from the get-go in, that conservation assessment process, from the instigation, information gathering, planning and execution of additional survey, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. Okay. So I better move. I didn't see my 10 minutes. So
just that we've still got quite a lot of stuff. This is a smorgasbord of what we do. We do a lot of stuff.
NT West McDonnell Ranges endemic is a recent example of where we've been involved, and it's resulted in a conservation assessment outcome that will see it listed as a threatened species in the NT. We assume. Another aspect of that is this hit the news this morning as well. So is around typhoniums. Many people might have heard of typhoniums, particularly those people in the top end here. They're a restricted range group of species in many instances to the top end of conservation significance. They're under conservation pressure. And they were really a prime candidate for some spatially explicit planning tools to be developed as part of a conservation strategy. Caroline, who's in the room today, she put many hours of effort and time into facilitating that with support from the herbarium at various steps along the way. And that was really culminated in the ability of us to produce, some actually quite useful conservation planning tools for that species, informed by not only the occurrence data but the population genetics of that species. So that's that was quite a nifty piece of work. That I think was
a good example of how applied our general work is. That we're really responding to real world problems, and we tend to work in that interface between management and. And of course, as botanists love to do along that journey, we realised that there was more than one species involved. So there's now 2 species which have been listed under the EPBC as threatened. So both endemic and restricted range within the Darwin region. That's just a picture of them. And of course, as we did more and more, we found there was another one that was involved as well. So now at some point we'll have to deal with that one too. So that's really kind of getting to taxonomy, systematics, and phylogenetics. It's one of our focus areas, but it is one that we really like to get involved in as much as we possibly can. Recognising that a lot of that is collaborative work, which I'll touch on later on, given the nature of our workforce and capability here in the NT. Our primary focus has been on alpha taxonomy, so the classical description and documentation of species, rather than beta taxonomy or comparative taxonomy, which is more about the relationships. But we're really interested in trying to use beta taxonomy as a vehicle to get alpha taxonomy done at the same time. So, where we really need more work done in alpha taxonomy is the huge number of phrase name taxa. So we have, you can see on there, 320 known. But undescribed. So there's species which occur in our checklist. We know that there's something different. There's no formal description of that species as of yet. And that's where alpha taxonomy really comes into its own, into doing those descriptions and working out what's going on. The beta taxonomy really is often, it means that we have a change of genus.
Like Ella.
Typically, that's where that kind of thing happens. And that's useful in a broader sense, but it doesn't get us out of the need.
We've kind of got an information gap that we need to get. So. And a recent example of some alpha taxonomic work, Dave Albrecht in Alice Springs, just earlier this year, he formally published this Hystrobrekia aureophila from Mount Zeal, another restricted range endemic thing occurring at high altitude. So, it's an ongoing process. What do we do? About 8 a year, I think. But we could do more, given that there's 320 sitting there. So challenges and opportunities. So it's important to remember the NT context, I think. Our primary focus is on the flora of the NT, but unlike many jurisdictions, we're small. We've got a large area, few people. There's unique land tenure and custodianship situations, and there's still a significant proportion of our flora that we believe to be undocumented in a traditional scientific sense. Those things really go around framing much of the scope of what our business is, with a strong focus on, as Lou mentioned, the applied aspects of research.
And it really also, we really rely a lot on our collaborations and our relationships. We invest a lot in our relationships. And there are
why we're here today.
there are whole groups of plants that we really can't do anything about on our own. And like Stylidium is a really good example. Australia's Stylidium expert, I guess, or specialist, is based in Perth, and she comes up, and we make a whole lot of progress in that with her help, but we can't do it on our own.
And this isn't a unique challenge, the taxonomic impediment, or whatever you would like to call it. It's long been recognised. There's plans that actually address it, or attempt to address it, with varying degrees of success. but you know, it's a challenge. But yeah, like Lou said, it's also an opportunity. And particularly that collaboration and that network that we have. Like, if you know, increasing our collaboration is something that you know will eventually incrementally move us forward. I think. Just on the non-vascular flora and fungi, if anybody ever wants to become a taxonomist, we think there's about 90% of the vascular plants. We kind of know what's going on. Fungi and algae, that's sitting at about 20%. So if you're somebody who's really interested in naming things, there's heaps to do. So technology is a challenge for us. We're of a certain size that you know, we can't actually sustain in-house molecular labs and things like that. So that's where collaboration is a real key for us. And you know, it shouldn't be understated the transformative aspect of the molecular sciences in supporting taxonomy in a current and future sense. IT infrastructure is also a challenge, you know, in a small jurisdiction in particular, but it also does provide us with some transformative opportunities. I mentioned before that idea of creating virtual herbaria that we can use to support different parts of the broader community. And you know, the ability for us to develop online flora platforms in a more sophisticated sense than what we have with the NT Flora is something that we're really interested in exploring further going forward. And you know, that speaks to, we don't actually have a singular NT Flora at this point in time, but we're really hoping that, you know, by keeping on top of technology and the IT systems in particular and exploring those opportunities collaboratively with other herbaria who do have that infrastructure in place, that we might be able to lever off that to progress that scope towards a centralised, you know, single point of truth for information about the NT Flora beyond just the checklist. You know, that then in turn supports all of our other functions. I won't dwell on this too much because I've probably already talked about it a bit, but our physical situation is a particular challenge and imminent. But also, I do want to I will just talk about a little bit about the changing roles and responsibilities of biological or natural sciences collections more generally. You know, we recognise that there's a role and a need for biological collections to change from what has traditionally been done, and particularly their responsibilities to all stakeholders and custodians, and for that to be properly recognised and embedded within our work practices. You know, the unique demographic, administrative, tenure and custodial profile of the NT, you know, certainly in an Australian sense, places us at the forefront of that change and provides us with a real opportunity to engage with that across all parts of the workflow in a right way. You know, and that goes from inception of research through what I'll call the collection and custodian of specimens and species records, to then a more responsive and informed way of how we actually, you know, deal with the information that's associated with them. It's a difficult space. Like, we're all finding our way in that sense, but it's something that we really need to be, and I personally think we really need to be engaged with and at the forefront of, given where we're placed.
Yeah, and it's evolving.
It is.
Yeah.
So we're going to make mistakes along the way, I'm sure, but we're going to try and learn from them. So Lou, I'll let you talk to this one.
Sure. So this slide's really about just indicating to you guys more broadly, CDU, that there are a lot of opportunities to engage with the herbarium, some of which are already in place. So we have a volunteer program at the herbarium where members of the public, including students, can come and volunteer, and they do mount specimens, enter data and that kind of stuff. And that's really a two-way exchange. We get benefit from that, and so does the student or the volunteer. We have a history of student placements from the university. So we have the SID 300 and the SID 500 professional placement units, and they've been very successful. We've had really good experiences with a number of students from the university, and they've been really beneficial to us. And again, I think the students have all got a lot out of spending time at the herbarium. There's also the NTG graduate internship program, which places students after they graduate with different parts of government, and there are opportunities to explore that if people want to explore that. There's a teaching and research resource of the institution itself. So historically, we've always done a lot of tours of the facility where students can come from the university and come and have a look at the collection, see what we do, get a bit more of the context of how the herbarium fits into plant information in the Northern Territory. And the ID, what we call the ID room, also has a reference set with microscopes and keys and so on. And so if people are working on particular groups, it is beneficial to be able to use that reference set. And certainly that reference set is open to the public for people who have got a certain amount of capacity and interest. So people can book the room and come and use a microscope and use the reference set. And there's opportunity for collaboration with courses and workshops and other botanical training activities. Nick mentioned earlier that we've been increasingly doing some more work in that, either facilitating or running our own botanical identification or training courses. And so there's probably an opportunity for collaboration in that space. There's always potential research collaborations at honours, masters, PhD level. There's a few topics that have been brought up here, and I'll bring up another one in a minute. This is a gamba grass. This is a potential, research topic here that I'm sure will be of interest to Natalie, amongst others. But it's been well known for a while that gamba grass that there's been these semi-hairless or hairless forms of gamba grass turning up. And it's been an increasing phenomenon. So just in the last few weeks, we've had 2 or 3 different records of fully hairless gamba grass, which is obviously that goes against the grain in terms of the typical diagnostic characteristics of gamba grass. We say to people,
particularly for land managers.
Exactly. So there's a number of things, stripes, but the hairs are usually quite diagnostic, particularly if there's no flowers. And we're increasingly getting these hairless forms, which is not inconsistent with what the species does in the native range. It's a lot more variable in its native range than what it is here. But there's certainly some research questions there about, is this, reversion to wild type and genetic drift, or are there different lineages? And this is not the only plant where this is occurring. We also have some work going on with olive hymenacne and native hymenacne regarding hybridization and, again, change over time. So these invasive plants, they don't necessarily stay the same. So that's just one example, but there are probably plenty of others. We'll just go back to the previous slide. Sorry. We just wanted to mention too that we do, the herbarium does a lot of pro bono work in the sense that we engage with a really wide variety of people, you guys and others, for all kinds of different projects where there's some kind of question or information about plants or vegetation that's required. So, there's the CDU Tropwater Seagrass work, which we got involved with. The Islands Biodiversity Project, I think Nick's getting involved with in terms of vegetation. There's the Arnhem Land Info Project, which we've had some engagement. I can see Andrew Cameron at the back there. There's plenty of different questions where the herbarium provides some low level or some important advice with regard to those projects, where we're not large project partners, but we certainly help out in some kind of way. And then, just as a conclusion, I think we've really just tried to provide an overview or a snapshot of the diversity of different things that we do. We do a large number of things. We are sometimes stretched a little thin, but there are lots of ways that the NT Herbarium and RIEL can collaborate more in the future. And we'd just like to invite that, and please get in touch with us to discuss if you've got some suggestions about things you'd like to do with us. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nick and Lou. We might open it up in the room first for questions. If you are online and have a question, please type it in chat. Any questions?
So I just wonder whether you have been able to deploy some of the high technology in this field. That's fantastic talk and the great opportunities that's involved. For example, 3D scanning, getting the 3D models of the plants.
Yep.
And maybe freeze dry of the specimen so it can keep its 3D vision.
Yep. Yeah, look, 3D scanning is particularly something that would be of interest to our broader vegetation team, and terrestrial laser scanning and things like that, particularly for vegetation structure, is a really, it's a real thing that it provides us with potentially a lot more, a lot more quantitative data than what's been done traditionally. So that's something that is really of interest, I think, going forward. The freeze drying, we haven't really explored it, but I know other herbaria definitely do cryogenic and freeze drying preservation of particularly their molecular samples and things. So that's something that we don't actually have the right kind of facilities to do it at the moment, but if it's something that we could collaborate on, that's something.
There's always evolving, like with Kim Brennan, who's a research associate with the herbarium, has been doing some really interesting photography of seeds, in particular with image stacking and so on, which are really getting
photogrammetry.
The photographic record of those things is just going to another level. And so our ability to kind of store and display those kind of images, or
we'd break our NTG websites if we tried to.
Yeah, and even in terms of the imaging of the specimens, we are collecting more data than we can possibly deliver.
Yeah.
So, but there's, some of the pictures are incredibly beautiful, like of flowers and seeds, close-up macro photography of these stacked images, which actually become sharp all the way through. The images are extraordinary, and I also think there's opportunities for exhibitions and displays, I guess, of some of these images to give people a better appreciation of the micro world. Art and plants, yes. Yeah.
Can I just make a comment on that? Nick, you might want to comment as well. We have to make just straight taxonomy sexy again as well, because there's fewer and fewer people actually wanting to do it. More and more students are wanting to do these exciting things and technology and stuff, but there are no taxonomists. There's so few, and there's none coming through.
Yeah.
So we need to make it exciting.
Yeah. It is a real challenge, and that decadal plan was really framed in a large part around trying to advance that. It's difficult, and it's something that's been talked about for a long time, Cameron, about how you do it. And I'd like to think that through some of this collaboration that we can do, particularly with the molecular scientists, it might kind of enable that a bit. Yeah, people don't want to be stuck in the dusty old herbarium looking at plants squashed between bits of newspaper kind of thing. But we're happy to do that. We'll do that bit if so.
I think there's potentially opportunity for. We need to really collaborate with interstate colleagues when it comes to some of those taxonomic questions frequently. But I could envisage a situation where you have perhaps a local student or a local researcher here that might be interested in a particular question, where you have another institution interstate on a collaborative project to untangle some taxonomic question. That's something within the scope of collaborations. And some of these questions that we brought, like that Pistia example, there are increasing number of taxonomic studies which are looking at intraspecies genetic diversity, and making conclusions about lineages and so on. And there's a whole lot of really interesting projects up here to do with some of these edge or grey taxa, the ivy gourds, the Robilia cochinchinensis, the itchgrass. All those things have got unanswered questions about: are they multiple lineages? Where do they come from? How long have they been here? So there's more work than we can possibly do, and we need to think about what's.
You mentioned ivory gourd. That very instant, that's what I was going to ask you. You mentioned how exciting the conundrum with Pistia.
Yeah.
But I want your answer today on the ivory gourd conundrum.
So we need to do some more work.
Yep.
So, there's an interesting question there, and almost parallel to Pistia in terms of both geographic location and behaviour. And, you know, Miranacha in the swamp is one of the places we've got very long-standing, old, you know, non-naturalised, apparently, records of ivy gourd from. So, you know, it needs some more untangling, but it's certainly the possibility exists that it could be a very similar situation to Pistia.
Well, we don't know, for example, whether the ivy gourd that occurs around Darwin, that could be a garden escape from someone that's brought material in from Southeast Asia.
Yeah,
it's a vegetable grown in gardens. Someone could have brought it into Australia through another pathway.
The conservation chapter.
Yes,
because it's a bloody nuisance.
Yes.
Natural area.
Yep.
So do we promote pulling it out? Or
Yes.
do we take a philosophical view? It might be a native to some level.
Well, I guess that's where we hope that being able to provide that little bit more resolution, and it goes back to that Pistia thing. Yeah, we could treat it as native, but it could be recognised as a limited declaration or something akin to that. That was like, in this situation, it's not the same thing and it behaves differently. So we're going to manage it. So, and sorry, there was an online.
And one for other people is where will you advertise workshops and training?
Yeah, so we've got a distribution list, and I can so if anybody emails us on that herbarium at nt.gov.au email address, one of us will pick it up and we can add people to. We've kind of got not a wait list, but a wait list of like a placeholder for people. So we're looking at potentially running a version of that grass course focused on the arid zone in upcoming, probably, I won't say months because it'll probably be a year, but so if anybody wants to reach out on that email, we'll add them in.
Are we going to do the monsoon?
It's not scheduled for this year, but we will do it again. Yep. They're busy doing it as part of the Australian, what's it called, Plant Conservation Society conference this year. So anyway, I think we're getting hurry up. So.
We have we have run out of time for questions.
Yep.
So I would like to say a big thank you to you both for your seminar today. I think
thank you.
And I'm hoping that you'll join us for morning tea.
Yes.
So people can continue to ask questions at morning tea, which will be in yellow 2 at 10:30. And I just wanted to also let people know about our next seminar, which will be on the 12th of June, which will be moving away from plants and looking at ghost bats.
So you can ask Nicola plenty of questions about plants. She's got a long history of working with plants with us. So